Hello and welcome to another gameplay commentary video for GiantSlayerTV. My name is Truth, and today we'll be watching a game from the perspective of Faye on patch 12.9. This game was played the day of the patch and is in the Diamond/Masters MMR bracket. The patch brought in a ton of crazy changes and the meta is all over the place. We'll be going through the decisions made by Faye as she navigates her way through a new patch. This endgame composition utilizes the recently buffed Draven, but a few key mistakes throughout the game result in Faye barely making it into the top 4. We'll be breaking down the key moments along with brief discussions about her game plan and board along the way. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, don't forget to click on the links in the description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to follow our GiantSlayerTV social medias. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, let's talk about what Faye's game plan is going into such a wild patch as it shakes up the meta entirely. This patch changed everything. Well, maybe that's a bit dramatic, but honestly, it's not too far off from the truth. There's a ton of changes and synergies, but also the introduction of a new system mechanic, the egg. On top of that, we've altered the augment tiers to be a bit more unpredictable, so every game has a lot more variance than before. Given that increase in variance along with balance changes, it can be difficult to play consistently well, especially at the beginning of the patch. Faye's plan is to keep it simple and focus on a few of the adjustments that look to be potentially the strongest for patch 12.9. That means using enchanters like Orianna and playing around vertical traits with the free tome from the egg. One of the best ways to try and figure out the meta is to aim for a solid early game because that gives you the most amount of leeway in the mid game. So for Faye, her goal is to play well early and transition her board on what she hits at level 7 and try and play around enchanters if possible. That also leads to what she wants to look for with early game components. Slamming generic items to win streak is the goal, but with maybe an item or two tailored towards Orianna for the later game. As always, the first major decision in the game is going to be around the 1/4 augment. This game looks to be on the tamer side as the tier is gold. All three of these options are viable. Salvage bin gives more control over items later on, meaning slamming items early isn't going to punish the player. But it is only one item, meaning 2 components. So technically less valuable than the 3 components of component grab bag. Weak spot in general is one of the stronger auto attack augments in the meta, with each tier being better than the previous. Given it's only 1/4 and Faye does want to lean into enchanters, weak spot may not end up being all that useful later on. Granted, playing Orianna really does usually mean Jhin, so it's not a bad choice after all. The end choice is component grab bag because, as mentioned before, the goal for Faye is to try and win as much as you can early game. Gaining 3 additional components to slam early items really helps with that. And eventually, we see her do this by making a Sojourn and Zeke's Herald. Both of these items do well later on in the game and can be used in a lot of different compositions, including enchanters. Overall, this is a rare moment where any of the augment choices were viable, and it goes to show why having a game plan can help make informed decisions. Already on a 2-win streak, Faye finds Tryndamere and has the option of leveling to 5 or selling Quinn and Singe to hit 10 gold. Given the plan is to continue winning early rounds, leveling to 5 makes the most sense, especially since Quinn can hold on to Sojourn. It's not always the correct choice to force levels, but if your board is stronger at level 5 with the champions you have available, then by all means level up. Faye would have still won this round without leveling, but at the cost of selling Quinn and losing out on a solid Sojourn holder for her board. Once again, sticking to the plan helps with the decisions, even if they are minor ones. We're into stage 3, and so far Faye has managed to maintain a win streak. But here is where she makes a mistake as she mimics an earlier play by leveling early to 6. It's by no means a surprise to see players leveling to 6 on 3-1, but it's important to know what your board is gaining before leveling. In Faye's case, she plays a level 1 Camille that gives her board 4 Challenger. The problem is that this doesn't give her much in terms of survivability or damage, just additional attack speed on her only level 1 Challenger units. She also gets a bit unlucky by running into the player that high rolled 2 4 costs from Krugs, but even if that wasn't the case, her board did not get significantly stronger from leveling to 6. This mistake puts her behind an econ and slows down her goal of hitting level 7. It's not a game-losing play by any means, but it's important to recognize when you can increase your board strength versus when you should sit on your gold. Really quickly before the augment round, we see Faye end up using her Tome of Traits from the egg and take the Clockwork emblem. This is actually quite useful for her board, but keep in mind you can always sit and wait and use your tome until later once you have a more established board. Using it early doesn't always pan out in your favor, since the lower amount of traits you have, the less tailored traits show up in the tome when you use it. Augment time. Looks like we're in for a standard game as its silver tier augments. None of these necessarily stand out right away, but we can immediately rule out backfoot. Backfoot isn't a bad option, but we already know Faye has 2 Zekes and a Clockwork emblem, meaning she doesn't need additional attack speed from an augment. That leaves 2 healing focus augments, which is quite good for Faye since she still aims to play Orianna and Enchanters. Social is always a good choice, but First Aid potentially scales better with Enchanters, especially Orianna. This is one of those times where the augment choice is pretty simple to make as Faye takes the First Aid kit. In Stage 4, we go where it's time for the good old level to 7 and roll. The previous meta was all about flex in the late game, but so many changes in 12.9, it's tough to say what the meta is and when players should roll. We know in this game that Faye is relatively healthy, but her economy took a hit in Stage 3, but she does need to stabilize before considering level 8. When rolling, Faye ends up hitting VIP Draven, Tryndamere 2, an upgraded frontline, and Orianna. This is a great foundation to build from, even if Draven wasn't part of her original plan. He still works well with Orianna. Her potential board from this point is tossing Jhin in and adding a bunch of frontline, plus Debonair for Draven. Keep in mind that Enchanters and Draven were buffed, so there isn't much of a need to stack damage dealers. Enchanters with frontline are basically sufficient enough because it buys Draven a lot of time with heals, shields, and CC. We'll see where Faye ends up making a mistake later on in her composition, but the idea behind using Enchanters with Draven is a solid one for now. We've arrived at the final augment of the game on 4-6, and it's another gold tier. At this point in the game, Faye is doing alright considering she's about to transition to level 8 and still has a decent amount of health. Taking a solid augment here may be enough to push her into top 4, and we see that she has some decent options. Right away, we can basically ignore High 5, though it can be a good augment to take. Effectively, it's just 20 gold and Faye doesn't need extra gold currently. Sure, she may find useful 5 costs, but none of 5 costs really help her board dramatically as 1-star units. So, High 5 is off the table. Cybernetic Shell was just nerfed, but when you compare the stats between it and Flanks, you're technically getting more value from Cybernetic if you have items spread out on multiple champions. Flanks is good for the backline, but unless you're putting every champion in the 2 back rows, Cybernetic is going to be overall more valuable, and that does end up being the option that Faye goes with. The extra health and armor is definitely welcome on Faye's board, especially considering that her largest weakness is a lack of frontline. Throughout Stage 5, Faye has managed to keep health loss to a minimum, but still has major problems on her board. First off, her frontline is terrible. Second, she ended up straying away from the game plan of using enchanters, as the only enchanter she currently has is Orianna. This problem is further emphasized when she ends up rolling into Zeri 2. While Zeri can be a good champion, without VIP or items, is she really worth playing? The answer in this game is no, but Faye commits the 15 gold and keeps her in. And on top of what she sells, a 2-star Sejuani to play Leona, especially to hopefully hit Leona 2 when rolling. Now Faye's board is left with a weak frontline and a lack of backline damage, but remember, we mentioned earlier that with the patch changes, Draven doesn't need a lot of additional damage, meaning both Zeri and Jhin are a bit redundant. Instead, if she focused on adding in additional frontliners and enchanters, she may be able to stabilize and make it to level 9 later on. As is, she's going to struggle to win against higher damage boards, which ultimately leads to only finishing 4th. It's do or die as Faye is on 8 health and not quite in the top 4. She needs to win this round while hoping the other low person loses. At this point of the game, it all comes down to scouting and positioning, which Faye does well here, keeping Draven as far away from danger as possible, while Orianna has a decent angle towards the enemy backline means she wins out easily. This is where having a lot of damage and some CC makes sense against boards that don't quite rip through her frontline fast enough. Again, we see this in the next round where good positioning and a low damage board aren't enough to defeat Faye. Unfortunately, this is the end of the road for Faye because the lack of survivability on her board gets absolutely ripped apart by the enemy's mercenary board. Good positioning can only go so far, but at least she was able to squeak out a top 4 finish. To sum up this game, we saw a fantastic early game from Faye, where she stuck with a solid plan and kept a 5-win streak going into Stage 3. There we saw the first mistake of leveling to 6 without a major power spike, which resulted in econ throughout Stage 3. In Stage 4, she rebounded with a decent transition into Draven, but again, the weaker econ in Stage 3 meant a slower level 8. At level 8, the largest mistake for Faye was playing the game too much like the previous patch. Instead of playing a damage-heavy backline, she could have stuck with the plan of enchanters and more frontline. Draven has plenty of damage after the buffs with a VIP active. So Jhin and Zeri are basically paperweights. Enchanters got a huge buff, and staying away from the plan to use them definitely put Faye in a weaker board state, resulting in a lot of losses and ultimately only being able to take a 4th. That said, we should put praise where praise is due, as her scouting and positioning were key in helping her secure that 4th. Overall, what this game shows is that sometimes a new patch is just that, new. Faye had some idea of what she wanted to do on the new patch, but ended up sticking with what she knew from the previous meta. This isn't bad, but it is a good way to learn, so don't sweat those types of games too much because ultimately it lends to learning the meta. That's it for today, folks, but let us know in the comments section what you'd like to see in our next gameplay commentary video. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying the content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.